To Layman's AI, a channel dedicated to making AI simple for everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about how you as a developer can use large language models to make your development productivity go up. I've done that myself. I've seen in my team, productivity has gone up by 30% easily just by adopting few of the use cases. And there is much more room for that. Most of the things I'm going to talk about are kind of obvious, but in my conversation with multiple developers, I've seen that they are not doing many of these use cases. So, if you're a developer or a person who leads a team of developers, this video is for you. We'll talk about multiple use cases of LLMs and tools like ChatGPT, which will help your journey as a developer, go up and speed up. So, stay tuned. So let's get started. My name is Sonny, and I do a lot of consulting and product dev around generative AI and AI in general. So let's get started. So we'll talk about the use cases for developers. How do you get started? So let's start with very basic use cases. The basic use case is code generation and suggestions, right? So let's say you are working. I'm taking some examples to as a reference for you to get a perspective. Let's say you're imagining you're working let's say you're working on a Python project where you need to write a function that just sorts a list of names alphabetically and removes any duplicates, right? Very simple use case, basic 101 kind of problem statement. Now, the basic use case of LLMs is code generation, right? So your prompt to an LLM is to just ask for the code or maybe a function that does what you want, right? So here is an example prompt that I sent to ChatGPT, and it comes back with a piece of code, right? I want a Python code, so this is Python code. You could ask it for any code that you want, in a programming language, right? So pretty simple, easy. You get the code, and you copy paste and start working on it. Yeah, just one tip that even for things which are very simple, I still use ChatGPT to write the code. The reason is the time it takes me to type in the code, the keystroke time is more than the time it takes me to write a prompt to ChatGPT and copy paste it from there. So, example, let's say I want to say loop over the rows of a data frame to do XYZ computation and add few columns. Let's say I want to do this. I could just write that. It's a very simple code which I could just go and write. I know it exactly how to write. I don't need to read documentation also. But the amount of keystroke time is more than it takes me to prompt it to ChatGPT or LLMs in general and get the code. So even for things that are obvious that it just makes sense to, it saves a lot of time when you just ask it. And for the complex use cases, definitely it's going to be more valuable. So simple thing. So you're writing code generation, go to LLMs and just ask for it. It gives you explanation. You can also follow up with your follow up this conversation with further explanations on why, for example, why did you use sorted function and not the inbuilt, let's say, sort method that is available in Python. So why, which is better? And you can ask these questions and it'll help you learn more about the nitty gritties of the programming language that you may not know, right? Moving to the next one is code review and debugging. This is the second most common use case, which is you're writing some code which you've already written, or maybe it is given to you by an LLM, but it is not giving you the desired behavior, right? So you could use LLMs to review your code and give you changes, which could be either bugs or performance enhancements. So, for example, just have a look at this simple function, which is find maximum from a list of numbers, right? If just pause the video and give it a couple of seconds of thought to understand what is wrong with this. Like, if you did that, you might have figured out that this max is not a variable which is supposed to be max underscore val. There's something fundamentally wrong here, right? But let's not try to think through it. Let's ask GPT and see what it says. So it says that the max variable has to be inside the loop, which is not correct, and there can be an index error also if the number list is empty, right? So basic test case is also been tested, right? And it gives you a better code. So very common use case, the code that you have written or your teammates have written or an LLM has written, you could use that code to, you can ask LLMs to find better answers, improve those question, improve those code and find performance improvement or even bugs in that, right? Moving to the next one, this is something which is useful for people who are getting started in development, or they are doing something which is which they don't know, right? They might be trying to implement some concepts which they have not used. So instead of going to a search engine and reading through multiple articles and content, what I prefer is to ask LLMs to explain things to me in simple terms, and then move ahead as I understand things better. Right? For example, let's say I want to understand the concept of recursion. Right? What is recursion? How does it work? Start it from me. Consider me as a basic level in this area. Explain to me things so that I can and give me examples and gradually take me to a step. Right? So before the pre-LLM era, if you had to answer this question, you would have spent a good amount of time researching on the internet, going through multiple articles and trying to understand what it is doing. But LLMs make that thing way more easier for you, and in a way that suits your current status uh, of competency. So let's say you are a beginner, so it can give you an answer which is good for you. If you're an advanced level person, it can also give an answer which is good for you. So that kind of thing helps you, learn things pretty fast. I mean, you could take anything that you don't know or you want to learn, probably go and try today and ask an LLM on information on that. So for this, it comes back with, like, for example, I tried this on ChatGPT. It gives me pretty good content on what is recursion, what are the example, what are the edge cases, how does it work, what is iterative recursion, what is the way to do things. It's a nice way of understanding concepts. So as a developer, great way to learn things. One of the very common use cases is documentation. Now, as a developer, I need to admit that I don't like writing documents, and it's true for everyone, because many times many times in that the time to write documentation is almost as much as the time to write the code itself, sometimes even more than the code itself. So honestly speaking, I also don't like writing documentations, and I don't blame my team when they don't write documentation. It's like the inherent, I would say, characteristics of most developers. And and that's where but at the same time, it's very important that documentation is important. While I don't like, but I still end up doing it, right? Because it is important. It helps you maintain the life cycle. It makes your code manageable. When you're not here, someone else is going to manage your code. It's going to help you. It's going to help them as well. So documentation is imperative. You need to do it. So LLMs come to the rescue. They make the process of documentation super easy. With prompting and giving the code and the context of the program that you've written, you can create documentation pretty fast. Documentations like inline docstring documentations, or writing full-fledged read the docs content. All of that you could do with LLM-based tools, right? So now I'm very happy, because now all the code that I write or my team writes, they do get push along with documentation. Now documentation is not an afterthought, and because it doesn't take too much time also, so it's a blessing for us. Now we do all documentation. So documentation is super critical. And for example, if you take this merge sort list function, ask it for documentation, it comes with nice documentation, and you can trim down or make it more depending on what is the requirement of the documentation, right? Automating a routine task, this is something that will come to you as a developer many times. So for example, let's say you're working in a project where you have to convert a lot of CSV files into JSON, right? You may not have the function already ready. Or let's say you have a bunch of CSV files you want to load to a database, or you have to write a query to pull rows from a database and convert them into data frame. There are many things, many routine tasks that you could think of. These are tasks that you might remember you have done that in past, but you may not get the code. You may not be able to recollect where that code is exactly, right? So routine tasks are things which are very generic, anyways useful, but you may not have kept that with you. So you LLMs are very good for doing this kind of thing, because these are not very complex problems, and it just saves you time. It's not that you can't do it, anybody can do it, just that it saves you a lot of time. I save a lot of time in automating routine tasks, things like that. So just ask for content again. It's a flavor of writing code, use case, but it's just that I'm talking about that any routine task that you do, you could just use LLMs for automating that, right? Okay, this is a very interesting part, which is probably not every developer can think through, because developers are mostly thinking on the on the code part of things. But this is an area which is good for everyone, not just developers, is idea generation brainstorming. So when you're building a product, or you're writing a piece of code, or you're doing things which are solving a problem, many times we are bounded by the things that we think is right or wrong, right, or the kind of capability that we should build, right? LLMs come with great powers when it comes to idea generation brainstorming. So I took the example of, let's say you're planning to build a mobile app for personal finance. Now let's say you're building a startup which is around this. Now, how do you go about that? What is the pain point that user might have? What are the features that I should look for? What are the tech architectures or tech components that I should look at? Many things that you can do. And this is, anyways, not just related to developers, but I, as a developer, and my team ends up using this use case pretty often, right? So, for example, you are thinking of implementing a search engine in a specific way, right? Where you're going to use, let's say, an in-memory database to store cache things, and you'll have a persistent blob storage to write, to persist the data, and then you're going to use something like let's say, a search algorithm to do similarity. Now you might be confused as to, is that the right approach? Can I do drop-in replacements for some parts? Is there better? What are the challenges? This kind of brainstorming, which you usually do in a boardroom, on the drawing board, is something that you can also do with LLMs. And trust me, this is something which will blow up your imagination and your ability to solve things beyond the current scope. So spend time on this very much. If you have been till here, I would request you to like this video if you think it's worth it, and probably consider subscribe as well. Yeah. Next is custom code templates. Okay, this is similar to the routine task that we talked about. Is when you're building some application, there are many part of the code that needs to be is like a template that needs to be built. So for example, if I'm building a pipeline which is doing, let's say, scraping and then publishing results in a website, I could automate the entire framework by using code templates, and then I can give the entire template to a actual developer to fill in things that they need to do. So as an architect, I could kind of prepare the boilerplate code and give it to them, and then ask them to fit in things where that needs to be. So it becomes very easy for them to exactly understand what they want, how the UI should look, how the backend should be structured, what is the API functionality. This gives you efficiency and consistency in the way you want the code to be built. You can obviously customize and scale your approach, right? But the major benefit is it reduces the overall time to market. So if I am the architect and I have a bunch of developers, I will use this kind of architecture to build the code template, how the front end should look, how the back end should look, how the API should look. I can create a template and I can give that template to them and say, fill in the gaps by the appropriate functionality. It just becomes a good starting point for the developers to move ahead. Exploring alternate solution. This is similar to the idea generation thing, but let's slightly more. I wanted to go slightly more deeper into this. Is, see, as a developer, you have some idea of how you want to solve a problem, but that may not necessarily, and that may be limited by your knowledge of things which are beyond your current capability. So let's say you are a front end developer, you really don't know how does a massive parallel processing engine works. Okay, what is this whole problem of time and space complexity that arrives when your user data increases. What is server side caching and what is client side caching, right? Maybe you are not aware of all of this. So for example, let's say you're building a web application that requires to filter a large data sets on the user input. Now let's say your initial solution is to just filter it on the client side by using some JavaScript, right? Now, the solution might be good for a small data set, but the moment the data set becomes large, there are a lot of challenges on doing this. Now, if you ask an LLM on various other ways to do this, there are multiple things that it can come up. For example, it can tell you something like a server side filtering, where you, instead of doing a client side filtering, you can move the filtering to server side, where the filtering is done on the server before the final filter data is sent to the user. You could do a database filtering, where instead of doing an in-memory thing, because if you do an in-memory filter, you need to have a large RAM available. You can push that to a storage like a database, and then query that, right? Which is like using a database to query, and then running like a SQL query on a database, and then taking the results and then show it to the user. You could think of an index search, which is to store the data as an indexed and then search that index. So index search is different from a database query because of the way it retrieves a content and the time it takes, right? The algorithm is defined a different way, designed a different way, right? And there's things like incremental pagination filters, and if your data is too large, you don't want to filter everything, you might want to paginate your filter. So these are many things that you as a developer may or may not know, or may know but still can't recollect that as a use case. So when you're building things, remember that LLM is your pro buddy sitting next to you. So you have to just ask it, saying that, okay, I'm thinking like this, is it the right approach? Constantly speak with your LLMs, because it will give you, it will flood you with ideas, good ideas, and you will definitely be able to use that to make good progress. Let's move to the next one, language translation. Okay, very common use case. If you're working on an environment, if you're working in an environment where there are multiple teams who work on different programming languages, and you want to write code in one and then translate, LLMs do pretty well. You can just ask them to translate code, and even if they don't get it right, they can still get you decent amount of code, which you can then again debug with the help of LLMs, and fix that and go ahead, right? So pretty useful in my sense, right? It also, for example, I sometimes use it when I have to write a piece of code which I want to explain something to someone else. But let's say he's writing code, let's say somebody's writing code in .NET, and I write code in Python, and I'm probably want to help that person do something which I'm thinking of doing. I write that in R, or Python code that I'm using, and then I translate that into the target language and I give it to them. Not that it will always work, but it gives them a good perspective of exactly what I'm thinking, and then the other developer can quickly take it from there. So language translation, programming language translation, is a use case that might make sense for you, for a team where diverse people with different programming languages present. So it becomes very easy for them to communicate. However, language translation could also mean translating between multiple languages, human spoken languages, right? For example, I have documents which, let's say you're building, you have, a team which is distributed, and there are multiple, language speaking people, and it makes sense for you to document things, or maybe in your platform or your product that you have, you want to, present things based on the consumer language. You could use LLMs again for that. For example, this string documentation could be converted from one language to another by using LLMs. Again, a great use case. These things were very difficult pre LLM stage. Now you have to use paid, custom language translation services and all of that. But now for the basic things, you already have things which are pretty good already, and you can move ahead with that. Data generation. Okay, now as a data scientist, one of the challenges that I would see, or my team will face, is you don't have the data that you need to build something, right? Or maybe as a web developer also, you might see that for you to build the UI, you need some data which is still not there in the database. And if you don't have good quality data, your charts and visualization don't come up well, and it does, just a hello world is not good enough. You need some kind of more data, but the data doesn't exist. So what? Generate that data. LLMs are very good at mocking data. So if you give them some data and saying, this is the kind of data that I have, I want you to create it, they just go ahead and create this data. And you could, these are all dummy data, and you can use this data to populate your database and then build your interfaces that you have. If you're data sciences and you want some dummy data to be simulated from your existing data, so that you have a large data to just testings, or maybe understand how it's working. Great way to do that. Data generation, this is again a use case that we end up using very frequently. uh, gone. So now, you as a developer don't need to complain to your manager that I don't have the data. How do I move ahead? Right? You just create the data. This gives you speed and efficiency, customization, and realism because you can create data in line to what data you already have. Right? You can give it sample data and then ask it to create more similar kind of data. Very useful. Right? Testing, this is a use case which people probably started using LLMs for as LLMs came out. And in fact, this is testing is the second most, I would say, um, not liked component after documentation for developers. So developers don't like doing testing and don't like doing documentation. It's a fact, right? Because we have this we have this feeling that what we write is already working. However, it's not true, and testing is undoubtedly the most important component in this entire life cycle, right? And you know what, LLMs and testing specialized LLMs are very good when it comes to solving this problem. Whether it is unit test or integration testing or user acceptance testing, every part of the testing lifecycle can be automated, or with this security testing can be done with this. So watch out, this area is, you'll see a lot of product companies building products focusing on advanced testing and security analysis of code. Again, I would say documentation you can do now with LLMs, and now testing also. So what more as a developer could you want, right? I mean, I could think that before LLMs, my life as a developer was way more complicated than it is after LLMs, and this is going to be true for everyone. A lot of things that you don't need to learn the way you learned in past. You would be learning them as you go, as you build and as you improve. So your time to market and your time to excel and your time to become advanced in your skill set is going to become much shorter as compared to an equivalent developer who have done that maybe 5 years in past. It's all good news. I'll just touch upon few tools. Again, there are multiple tools that are coming out in the market. Few of this which I've personally used, and everyone has its own specialty. Some are designed for, let's say, coding much better. Some are general purpose. But I would suggest, and all of these are available as extension in your IDE, so you could just install the extension in your IDE, and then within your IDE, you will be able to use these tools, right? Now, one thing that I want to tell you is this is an area of active research. So, which means that most of new tools are going to come in. You need to do probably a study on the privacy of these tools. What do they do with your code? Do they see the code? What do you do? So the entire privacy is important in the security of of your code. You have to go through it. Does it comply with your company's regulation, right? The best practices that you have, the reputation of the vendor, all of that. So before you finalize any of the enterprise grade tools, you need to probably look at these factors, and this is changing with time. So my opinion today might change after 6 months, right? So you have to constantly look for which one is, try, evaluate, and see if it makes your if it meets your uh, standards. Okay, one thing is, one question that I often get asked multiple people is, if developers are writing everything through AI, so what will actually developers do, right? That's a very existential question that comes in the minds of many developers. So there was a nice study done by IDE on the IDE data set, by IEEE, and what they found is, most of the time, majority of the time a developer spends is not actually writing code, is on the understanding and the thinking process of solving problems, which is, I personally agree with all of this, and it's actually true. A developer doesn't write code most of the time. Most of the time they're thinking outside the code, which is the problem statement and all of this. Unfortunately, many people don't think that's true. They only think that a developer writes code, and code writing is automated, so what a developer does. So it's not true. You as a developer don't need to worry about that. I honestly think that the way we write code is going to change, but the same developer is going to do things much faster by using these AI tools. One a more interesting paper that I want to mention is on security. There was a study done, which and the outcome of the study was that people who use LLMs to write code In general, they write less secure code. Okay, and this is important to understand, which means that you, as a developer, when you start using LLMs, you need to, you need to improve your ability to understand whether it's secure or not, and that needs more follow-up conversation with LLMs on, is it secure, is it performant, what can I do. You could also use, you also have to necessarily use another, another validation on the security. For example, we use two LLMs from two different vendors, one for writing code and the one to do the security analysis. So that way it kind of helps us. So it's very important, don't trust the LLM code blindly, because they, there's a high chance can be wrong, and they can mess up your production code. So the, with powers, with powers comes responsibility, right? So exactly, that's true for LLMs. It'll make things life easier for you, but it will also be very horrible if you are not aware of that. With this, I also want to add one pro tip, which is, all of this means that you as a developer have to become a better developer in the future world. It is not that you have to become a worse developer or a basic developer. There's no space for basic developers in the future. The very good guys are going to be there in the future, because if you're not good, you will actually spend most of the time debugging whatever you're getting from these tools. If you're good, you will know how to prompt it well, how to understand whether the response that you're getting is good, how to correct it, and how to move fast. So you'll have very less bugs and your productivity will go up. So that's why I'm saying again that as a developer, you need to become a better developer in the near future, right? So last part is, we'll talk about some fundamental concepts around prompt engineering. How do you want to, what are the things that you need to talk about, consider when you're building these prompts as a developer. So, few very simple things is, A, be specific in detail. Don't assume what is in your mind is also what the LLM is thinking. No, be specific, to the point, and detail. Be specific is important. So if you ask it to solve world hunger, it'll give you too much, which is may not be true. So be specific, get to the point. Exactly. So let's say you want to write a function which will take something as an input, give something as an output. You write exactly that, and try to be as detailed as possible with examples so that it gets it. Don't try to start with too broad. Let's say if I say, write the code to build a new operating system similar to Linux, and that's too broad thing, you should not start with. But if you write, let's say you want to build a new grub compiler to handle RAM and hard disk, maybe that's something which is doable. That you can, so it's important to be specific and detailed. Include context. Again, don't ask things which are generic. Try to include context about what your problem statement is, where are you coming from. If you're writing a part of a function, where is it coming from and what you're supposed to do. Context will give you better response. In fact, including what programming languages you're using, what architecture you're using, what is underlying hardware. If you give all of this, what, it will be helping you. State your requirements clearly. This is important because I have seen people not asking questions in the right way. One of the skill that you will learn over time is how to ask questions in a very clear way, not ambiguous, right? This is a skill that you have to, you will realize once you start interacting with LM, that you say something, it gives you a wrong answer, and then you realize that, okay, you were not very, very clear in exactly what you wanted. So be very clear with what you want, right? Use technical language. So if you know that there is a way to solve this problem, there are 100 ways to solve this problem, but the better ways are using some specific approach. It's better to tell them. So example, let's say if you think that to solve this problem you have to use a recursion based approach, and you have to use an in-memory object to store this. You tell it that I want to use this, and I want to solve it in a linear complexity and not quadratic complexity. And so that kind of, because there are many solutions available and maybe all of them are correct, but some are more correct than the other, right? So when you as a developer know what is more correct than the other, you can guide the tool to in that direction. Define constraints and limitations. Again, this is about how do you what are the constraints that you have, what it's supposed to do, what it's not supposed to do. All of that you can capture. Examples, again, you have to give in context examples, easy to understand. Clarify the scope, coding standards, iterative approach. Right. Again, I will go through this very quickly because these are kind of self-explained. Feedback loop is the last part, which is where what you do, you get an output, you come back to the tool saying this is not what I wanted, or this you want some kind of optimization, and then follow up. And then most likely the first code that you get from the tool, from the LLM, may not necessarily fit completely into your requirement, and you have to follow up with that. But if you follow this, hope you got some ideas on where you can get started. I wish you good luck, and I wish that you will be taking some points back home and implementing them. If you like this, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video. We'll talk about more hands-on example on how to get started with LLMs. Thank you.